Keanu Reeves had always prided himself on keeping a low profile. Despite his fame, he liked to keep things simple. His life was a peaceful balance between work, friends, and quiet moments of reflection. On this particular morning, he found himself at a small, cozy cafe in the heart of Los Angeles, where the gentle hum of conversations blended with the faint smell of fresh coffee brewing. Keanu sat by the window, staring out at the bustling street. As he sipped his coffee, lost in thought, the world outside moved in a blur, people rushing past, the sun shining down, and the usual city noise, yet for Keanu, this moment felt almost like a sanctuary. There was something calming about the simplicity of it all. But today was different. Today, his peaceful routine would be disrupted by something he never saw coming. The door to the cafe chimed as it opened, and in walked the cafe owner, Victor. Victor was a man in his mid-40s with a sharp suit, a furrowed brow, and an air of arrogance that seemed to fill the room. He glanced around the cafe, his eyes scanning the regulars before they landed on Keanu. The moment their eyes met, something changed. Victor's face twisted into a look of recognition, but it wasn't admiration. It was something else, something not quite so kind. "Well, well, well," Victor muttered loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "If it isn't Keanu Reeves himself, slumming it in my little corner of the world." Keanu raised an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard correctly. He had expected a simple acknowledgement, a quiet nod maybe, but this was different. Victor smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "You know, I've always wondered, how does it feel to be a Hollywood star? To have the world worshipping you for pretending to be someone else? Is it as hollow as it looks?" The room went silent. People exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to react. Keanu, ever the professional, kept his calm demeanor. He didn't respond right away, hoping this was just a passing moment of unprovoked aggression. But Victor wasn't done. "Don't get me wrong," Victor continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're a good actor, but that's about it, right? Not much else going on up there, is there?" Keanu's gaze remained steady. It wasn't the first time he'd been ridiculed for his fame. He had learned a long time ago to ignore the noise. But there was something about Victor's venomous tone that struck a chord. Something about the way Victor was openly mocking him in front of a room full of people who were now watching, waiting for Keanu's reaction. Keanu took another sip of his coffee, trying to keep his composure. He had been through much worse in his career, but it still stung even if he didn't show it. "You're right about one thing," Keanu finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It's easy to judge from the outside, isn't it?" Victor chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "I bet it is." Keanu set his cup down slowly and stood up, still maintaining that unshakable calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also couldn't let Victor's insult slide. Not when it was so public, so unnecessarily cruel. "I came here for peace, not a lecture," Keanu said, his eyes never leaving Victor's. "But since you've chosen to make a scene, I'll leave you to it." He nodded to the other patrons, who were still watching in stunned silence, then turned to walk out of the cafe. As he left, he could feel the eyes on his back, the whispers following him out the door. It wasn't about the insult anymore, it was about the fact that people had seen it happen. They had witnessed this man, someone who was supposed to represent hospitality, attack a customer, a famous customer no less. The door closed behind him, and the moment of discomfort lingered in the air. But as Keanu walked away from the cafe and into the street, something in him changed. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a quiet resolve, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this moment could be the catalyst for something bigger. And so, as the sun shone down on him, Keanu made a decision. He would return. Not for revenge, but for something deeper, something no one would expect. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day after the confrontation at the cafe, Keanu couldn't shake off the words that Victor had thrown at him. He had been insulted many times before, but this felt different. There was something about the way Victor had spoken, so openly, with such disdain. Keanu had remained composed, even left quietly, but the incident lingered in his thoughts. It was one thing to be ridiculed by strangers, but another thing entirely when the humiliation came from someone who should have been showing kindness and respect. That morning, Keanu found himself sitting at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and staring at the screen of his phone. He wasn't just thinking about the insult itself, but about the bigger picture. What kind of person could publicly tear someone down like that? It wasn't just about him, it was about what it said about Victor's character and what it meant for the world around them. Keanu didn't know it at the time, but that moment would become the turning point. There was a feeling deep inside him, a spark of something that said, this isn't over, not yet. And so he made a choice. He would return to that cafe. Not to defend his reputation, not to get into a shouting match, but to do something that no one, least of all Victor, would expect. Later that afternoon, Keanu slipped into a jacket and left his apartment. As he stepped out into the sunshine, the bustling streets of Los Angeles seemed almost too normal. The world was moving forward, but Keanu couldn't help but feel that he was standing still in some way. Something about the encounter at the cafe had shaken him more than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about the insult, it was about the fact that it had made him question his own response. Was he truly the calm, collected person everyone believed him to be? Or was there something deeper at play, something more human? Keanu walked toward the cafe again, his footsteps deliberate but not rushed. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the street, but Keanu's mind was elsewhere. As he approached the familiar cafe, he saw the same faces through the window, but this time there was a tension in the air. The employees were wiping down tables and a few regulars were chatting, but there was no sign of Victor. He walked in, the door chiming once more as he entered, and almost immediately the room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, just like yesterday. The silence was palpable, the kind that made everything feel more intense than it really was. Keanu's eyes searched for Victor, but there was no sign of him at the counter. The cafe seemed quieter than usual, with fewer patrons scattered around. Something was off. The cheerful energy that had filled the cafe yesterday had evaporated. Instead, there was an almost uncomfortable stillness. He made his way to the counter where a young barista, Sarah, looked up in surprise as he approached. She had been one of the regulars in the cafe when Keanu had been there the day before. "Hi, can I get the usual?" Keanu asked, his voice as calm as ever, though something in his tone betrayed a slight tension. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded quickly, eager to serve him. She pressed a button on the espresso machine, but her hands shook slightly as she did. I'm sorry about yesterday," she said, glancing down at the counter, her voice filled with guilt. "Victor's not usually like that. He's going through some stuff." Keanu smiled gently, not letting the awkwardness of the moment get to him. "It's okay. People have bad days. I get it." Just then, the door to the back of the cafe opened and Victor stepped out. His eyes locked with Keanu's, and for a moment neither man moved. Victor's face was a mixture of surprise and something else, something like discomfort. He had clearly been expecting this moment, but he wasn't sure how to handle it. Keanu stood still, waiting for Victor to make the first move. After a long pause, Victor cleared his throat and took a step forward. "I didn't expect to see you back here," Victor said, his voice colder than it had been the day before. He was trying to appear unaffected, but Keanu could see the cracks in his facade. Victor's bravado had begun to fade. Keanu nodded, giving him a small smile. "Yeah, I had a feeling we weren't done yet." Victor's lips tightened, clearly unsure of how to respond. His face flushed, and for a moment, he looked like a man caught in the middle of something he didn't fully understand. I didn't mean to go off on you like that yesterday," Victor muttered. "I was frustrated. The cafe's been struggling and, well, I guess I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." Keanu nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised by the admission, but he could see the guilt in Victor's eyes. This was the first time the cafe owner had shown any vulnerability. For a brief moment, the aggressive exterior cracked, revealing something human beneath. "I understand," Keanu said softly. "I've been in your shoes before. Sometimes it's easier to lash out than to face the real issues." Victor looked at him, confused. "What do you mean by that?" Keanu paused, thinking for a moment. Well, I'm not here to make excuses for you, but I get it. We all have our moments where we feel like everything is slipping out of our control, but when that happens, it's important to ask ourselves why we're really angry and who we're really angry at. Victor's expression shifted slightly, his gaze now focused on Keanu. It was clear that this wasn't the response he had expected. He had expected confrontation, maybe even a public scene. Instead, Keanu had chosen empathy, and it was that. Empathy rather than the anger that began to break through Victor's hardened exterior. For the first time since the incident, Victor seemed to be listening, not just hearing, but actually processing what Keanu was saying. I don't know what to say, Victor murmured, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. I've been frustrated for a long time. The cafe's been losing business, and it's been a lot to handle on my own. I guess I just let it get to me. Keanu looked around the cafe, noticing the lack of energy in the room. He could see now that Victor's frustration wasn't just a personal issue. It was affecting everyone in the cafe, from the employees to the regular customers. This was more than just a petty spat. It was a cry for help, and Keanu had been the one to recognize it. You don't have to do this alone, Keanu said, a glimmer of a plan forming in his mind. Sometimes, all it takes is a little help from others. Victor didn't respond right away, but his eyes softened. For the first time, he seemed willing to listen, to not just the words, but to the deeper meaning behind them. And with that, Keanu had made his choice. He wouldn't just let this moment slip away. He would help. But how? That was the question that lingered in the back of his mind as he stood there, waiting for Victor to take the first step towards something more meaningful than either of them could have expected. The next few days were a blur. After that tense but revealing conversation with Victor, Keanu found himself thinking about the cafe more than he expected. The encounter had awakened something in him, a desire to help, to do more than just walk away and forget about it. It had been so long since he'd stepped outside of his own world, outside of the roles he played on screen. But now it felt different. The reality of Victor's struggles resonated with him on a level he hadn't anticipated. Keanu was no stranger to hardship. He had faced loss, loneliness, and personal tragedies in his life, things that had shaped him into the man he was today. But he also knew that sometimes the hardest part was reaching out for help. That's what Victor needed, and Keanu was determined to be the one to offer it. After a few quiet days of reflection, Keanu made his decision. He was going to help Victor turn the cafe around. It wasn't going to be easy, and Keanu knew it. Small businesses, especially cafes, were notoriously difficult to keep afloat. But there was something about this place. The sense of community, the people who came every day for their coffee, the atmosphere that felt like home. It deserved a chance. And if Keanu could be the catalyst for that change, then it was worth every second. Keanu began to visit the cafe daily, each time quietly observing. He watched how the staff interacted with the customers, how the regulars came and went, and how Victor seemed increasingly frustrated behind the counter. There was no denying that the cafe's decline was visible: empty seats, quiet conversations, and a lack of energy that once filled the room. But Keanu knew there was potential here, hidden just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as he sat near the window, he saw Victor pacing nervously behind the counter, his eyes darting to the empty seats. The cafe was practically empty, and Victor's frustration was palpable. Keanu could see that the weight of it all was wearing him down. Finally, Keanu stood up, walked over to the counter, and leaned in. "You know," he said, his voice casual, "I've been thinking a lot about this place." Victor looked up, clearly startled. "What are you talking about?" Keanu smiled. "I think this cafe has more potential than you realize. The community here is great, and I know a thing or two about turning things around. You don't have to keep struggling alone." Victor narrowed his eyes, skeptical. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything?" Keanu didn't flinch. "No, but I think we can work together and make it better. You've got a loyal group of regulars, you've got the space. All you need is a little bit of a spark, and that's where I come in." Victor stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. He looked like he was about to say something sharp, but instead he took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't know, man. It's been hard. The bills keep piling up, and no matter what I do, it feels like we're sinking." Keanu's gaze softened. "I get it, but giving up isn't going to help, and you're not alone in this. We can fix this together." There was a long pause, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Victor's shoulders sagged even further as he looked down at the counter, his fingers tapping absently. It was clear he didn't know where to start. That's when Keanu decided to push the idea forward. "Here's the plan," Keanu said, leaning in a little closer. "You've got loyal customers, I've seen them, and what they love about this place isn't just the coffee, it's the vibe, the energy. What you need is a fresh start, a relaunch, new ideas, a way to get people excited about coming here again. I'm not talking about flashy marketing or some huge campaign. I'm talking about small, meaningful changes, a bit of innovation." Victor looked at him, his eyes still filled with doubt. But there was something else there now. A flicker of hope, maybe, or at least the idea that there was a possibility of change. "You really think it could work?" Keanu smiled, knowing that now was the time to inspire action. "I do. But it's not just about the coffee, it's about the experience, the people, the energy. If you build that, the rest will follow." Over the next few weeks, Keanu and Victor worked together, brainstorming ideas for the cafe. Keanu made subtle suggestions, introducing new drinks, revamping the decor, and hosting small community events to bring in more foot traffic. But it wasn't just about the physical changes. It was about shifting the way people thought about the cafe. Keanu wanted to remind them that this wasn't just a place to get coffee. It was a place where connections were made, where stories were shared, and where people could come together and feel like part of something bigger than themselves. Victor, at first hesitant, slowly began to warm to the idea. The more they worked on it, the more he started to see the potential in Keanu's vision. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a way out of the struggle. But as with any journey, things didn't go smoothly right away. There were setbacks. The cafe still wasn't drawing in the numbers they needed, and there were moments when both Keanu and Victor felt like they were on the edge of giving up. The staff was burned out, the customers still hesitant, and the cafe's future seemed uncertain. One evening, as Keanu was sitting with Victor after the cafe had closed, they both sat in the quiet, reflecting on the day. The place was empty again, the air thick with the weight of exhaustion. Victor sat across from Keanu, his head resting on his hands. "I don't know, Keanu," Victor said, his voice tinged with defeat. "It feels like it's just not enough. We've tried everything, and it's not working." Keanu looked at him, his voice steady. "This is the hard part. This is when most people give up, but we can't, not yet, we're close." Victor raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Close to what?" Keanu's eyes twinkled with quiet determination. "Close to the breakthrough. It's always darkest before the dawn, right?" Victor didn't reply, but he nodded, as if finally beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, Keanu was right. They weren't done yet, not by a long shot. The real challenge had just begun, and neither of them knew it. But the next step in this journey would bring them to a crossroads neither of them could have foreseen. But for now, Keanu had planted a seed, and it was starting to grow. How far it would go was yet to be seen, but one thing was certain: the cafe would never be the same again. As the days passed, the tension in the cafe reached a boiling point. Despite Keanu's best efforts to bring fresh ideas and energy to the place, there were still constant reminders of the struggles that weighed heavily on Victor and the staff. The cafe had started to show signs of life. Small signs, to be sure, but nothing was enough to lift the cloud that hung over Victor's head. The community events had drawn a few new faces, but not nearly enough to offset the mounting bills and the declining numbers of regular customers. The new drinks were a hit with some, but others preferred their old favorites. The decor had been updated, but it hadn't quite managed to spark the kind of excitement Keanu had hoped for. Victor was growing increasingly frustrated. His patience was wearing thin, and Keanu could see it in the way he walked into the cafe. Every morning, his shoulders slumped, his eyes tired and empty. It wasn't just the cafe that was draining him. It was the feeling of defeat that hung over him like a heavy weight, making it harder for him to move forward. And yet, Keanu couldn't give up. He refused to. He'd been through too much in his own life to let someone else fall into despair. He knew that Victor needed more than just a business plan. He needed a shift in perspective. He needed a reason to believe again. One evening, after a particularly slow day at the cafe, Keanu decided it was time to push through the last barrier. He couldn't just keep offering solutions that Victor wasn't ready to hear. This was a moment of reckoning, and it had to come from within. He called Victor to the back of the cafe, where the hum of the espresso machine was the only sound in the otherwise silent space. The air between them felt thick, tense, like something was about to break. Keanu had decided to approach this differently, to reach Victor in a way that wasn't just about business. He needed to speak to the part of Victor that was still human, the part that still believed in the possibility of something better. Victor walked over, his face shadowed by exhaustion and doubt. "What's going on, man?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Keanu stood by the counter, his hands resting lightly on the edge. "I've been thinking about this," Keanu said, his voice steady but filled with intent, "and I realize something important." Victor gave him a tired, questioning look. "What's that?" Keanu paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before he continued. "It's not just the cafe that's struggling, it's you, Victor. You're the heart of this place. If you don't believe in it, if you're not willing to fight for it, then nothing else will work. You're the one who needs to make the change, not the cafe. You." Victor's face flickered with something, surprise, anger, maybe even a touch of shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but Keanu held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not saying this to put you down. I'm saying it because I know you. You're a fighter, but you've been so focused on the business that you've forgotten about yourself. You're drowning in all of this, and you're not giving yourself a chance to breathe. That's why nothing is working. You need to reconnect with why you started this place in the first place. You need to remember the dream." Victor stood still, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else. Something softer. Keanu could see the walls that had built up around him, the defenses that had kept him from opening up. But Keanu also saw the crack in those walls. It was small, but it was there. "I don't know if I can do it anymore," Victor finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's too much. I feel like I'm sinking." Keanu's eyes softened. He stepped closer to Victor, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do it alone. We're in this together. We can fix this, but you have to believe in yourself first. You're stronger than you realize." For a moment there was silence. The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air, and Victor didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the counter, his mind clearly racing. Keanu didn't know what would happen next, if Victor would have a breakthrough, if he would finally take a step toward change. All he knew was that this moment was crucial, and then something unexpected happened. Victor, with a slow, almost imperceptible motion, sat down at one of the empty tables in the back. His shoulders were no longer hunched in frustration, but sagged under the weight of something else, something deeper. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a long, shaky breath. "I don't know where to begin," he said quietly. Keanu took a seat across from him. "We start with small steps, one thing at a time. The business will follow if you can reconnect with why you started all of this, why you opened this cafe in the first place. Think about that." Victor sat in silence, for a long time processing. Keanu knew that this wasn't the easy answer, that there was no quick fix. This was going to take time, hard work, and trust. But then, slowly, almost as if the weight of it was beginning to lift, Victor looked up at Keanu. His eyes were different now, clearer, with a spark of something new. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "I lost sight of why I started this place. I got so caught up in the numbers and the pressure that I forgot about the people. I forgot about what makes this cafe special." Keanu smiled. "It's never too late to get back on track, but you have to trust yourself first." For the first time in what felt like forever, Victor smiled back. It wasn't a big, triumphant grin, but it was something. A flicker of hope. "Think I can do this," he said, his voice more confident than it had been in weeks. "I really do." Keanu's heart lifted as he stood up, ready to help Victor take the first steps toward a new beginning. But just as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, another challenge loomed. There was one last test, one final piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place. Victor's journey was far from over, and Keanu knew that the real work was just beginning. Would they be able to overcome the final hurdle? Could the café truly be saved? The days that followed were a blur of effort, sweat, and a renewed sense of purpose. Victor had slowly but surely begun to rediscover the spark that once fueled his passion for the café. The walls that had kept him distant were beginning to crumble. He had learned to trust Keanu's guidance, and together they started making decisions that shifted the café's energy. Victor began reconnecting with the community. He started hosting more intimate events, live music nights, book clubs, even small local art exhibits. The regulars began to show up again, drawn by the sense of community that had been absent for so long. The café began to feel alive once more, but just when it seemed like the café was on the path to recovery, something unexpected happened. The café was hit with a significant setback, one that threatened to undo all the progress they had made. It started with a phone call. Victor was standing behind the counter one Tuesday afternoon when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It was his landlord. Victor's stomach dropped. He'd been expecting this call, but that didn't make it any easier to take. His rent had been overdue for months, and though the landlord had been patient, the constant delays and the quiet but steady decline of the café had started to take a toll. He answered the phone with a forced calmness. "Hello?" "Victor." The landlord's voice was tight, businesslike. "I've given you enough time, but I need the full payment now. You're behind by 2 months and I can't continue to let this slide. If you can't pay up by the end of the week, I'll have no choice but to start the eviction process." Victor's heart sank. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand. I'll do everything I can to get the payment. Together." But in that moment, Victor knew there wasn't much he could do. The café was barely making ends meet, and though it had regained some of its charm, it still wasn't enough to cover the mounting debts. If he couldn't come up with the money in time, the dream he had fought so hard to keep alive would be over. The café, the place he had poured his heart and soul into, would be lost. He hung up the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him more than ever before. For a brief moment, he thought about throwing in the towel. Maybe it was time to face reality, to accept that some dreams just weren't meant to be. But then, he thought of everything he had built with Keanu's help, everything they had worked for. He couldn't give up now, not when they were so close. Victor stood there for a long time, his mind racing. How could he pull this off? Where could he get the money? The café was finally starting to feel like home again, and it was being threatened by a simple number: money. He needed a miracle. As if on cue, the door of the café opened and Keanu walked in, his usual calm presence filling the space. He saw Victor's face immediately and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Keanu asked, sensing the tension. Victor shook his head, his voice low. "I just got off the phone with the landlord. If I don't come up with the rent by the end of the week, they're going to evict us. All this work, it might not even matter." Keanu's eyes narrowed as he listened, and then he stepped closer. He didn't say anything for a moment, but his presence alone was enough to make Victor feel less alone in that moment. "What do we do?" Victor asked, his voice strained with the weight of the situation. Keanu didn't hesitate. "We figure this out, together. There has to be a way." Victor looked at him, doubt clouding his thoughts. "How? What do you suggest?" "I don't have the money, Keanu. I just don't." Keanu thought for a moment, tapping his fingers against the counter. "Let's think about it. We've got a community here, right? People who care about this place. We can't let it go down without a fight." Victor raised an eyebrow, unsure. "What are you getting at?" Keanu's eyes twinkled with a spark of something. Determination, maybe. "Crowdfunding." Victor blinked, confused. "What?" "Crowdfunding," Keanu repeated. a plan forming in his mind. There are people out there who love this place, who want to see it succeed. We've got a story, we've got a purpose. We can reach out to the community and ask for help. Victor shook his head. It's not that simple. People don't just give money away. Keanu leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. Sometimes they do, especially when they believe in what you're doing, and you've got something people want to support. You're not just asking for money, you're asking for a chance to keep a dream alive. People connect with that. We're going to tell your story, and you'll see how many people will come to your side. Victor stood there for a long moment, uncertainty clouding his expression. But Keanu's calm conviction slowly began to chip away at his doubts. Maybe this was the way forward. Maybe, just maybe, it could work. All right, Victor said finally, his voice a little steadier now. Let's give it a shot. They spent the next few hours working on a crowdfunding campaign, crafting a message that would resonate with the people who had supported the cafe over the years. Keanu helped Victor write out the story of the cafe, how it had been a dream from the start, a place for people to come together, to share in something bigger than themselves. They spoke about the struggle they had faced and the hope that was still alive. Once the campaign was live, they shared it on every social media platform they could think of, reaching out to friends, family, and loyal customers. Keanu even made a heartfelt video about the cafe's journey, explaining why it meant so much to him, how it wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of community, of resilience, and of the power of never giving up. As the days passed, the key donations began to roll in, small contributions at first, but then bigger ones. People who had frequented the cafe for years were now stepping up, offering what they could to help keep the doors open. It wasn't enough yet, but the momentum was building. The community was rallying behind the cause. Then, on the final day, the day before the eviction deadline, the campaign hit its goal. They had raised enough to pay the rent with some extra left over to keep things running for the next few months. Victor stood in the cafe, staring at the screen in disbelief. He turned to Keanu, his eyes wide. "We did it," he said, barely able to process the reality of it. Keanu smiled, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "No, you did it. You made it happen." Victor looked around the cafe, a rush of emotion flooding over him. He couldn't believe it. The cafe was safe. The dream was still alive. And in that moment, Victor realized something profound. He wasn't alone. He had a community behind him, and together they could overcome anything. The cafe was alive again. The soft hum of chatter filled the air as the loyal customers returned, some of them even sharing their stories about how they had helped contribute to the crowdfunding campaign. It wasn't just the cafe that had been saved. It was the spirit of the community, reignited by a shared belief in what Victor and Keanu had built. It was a triumph, a victory that brought warmth to the heart of every person who walked through the door. For the first time in months, Victor allowed himself to relax. The weight that had once threatened to crush him seemed to lighten. The looming threat of eviction had passed, and in its place was a sense of cautious optimism. But Victor knew there was still work to be done. The cafe had survived, but survival wasn't enough. He wanted to thrive. He needed to prove that it wasn't just a fluke, that this wasn't just a momentary victory, but the start of something bigger. There was no going back now. Keanu, ever. The optimist could see the potential too. He encouraged Victor to keep the momentum going, to take risks, to push for new ideas. But despite his relief, Victor couldn't shake the nagging doubt that still lingered in his mind. What if the cafe wasn't meant to survive? As Victor sat in the back office late one evening, the sounds of the cafe still buzzing in the distance, he reflected on everything that had led to this point. How many nights had he stayed awake, wondering if he had made the right decisions? How many times had he thought about throwing in the towel, giving up and walking away? And yet, against all odds, here he was. The reality was that the cafe's future wasn't secure yet, not in the long term. The crowdfunding had kept the doors open, but it hadn't solved every problem. The bills kept coming, and there were still months of uncertainty ahead. It was a fragile victory, and the next challenge could be waiting around the corner. Victor sat back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips as he thought about the future. That's when Keanu entered the office, a cup of coffee in hand. "Don't. Tell me you're still thinking about all that," Keanu said, dropping into the chair across from Victor. Victor gave him a tired smile. "You're right. I should be celebrating, but it feels like we're walking a tightrope. The ground beneath us is still shaky." Keanu's expression softened as he leaned forward. "I get it. But let me tell you something. Success isn't about never facing challenges. It's about facing them and still moving forward. No one ever made it to the top without falling down a few times." Victor glanced at the coffee cup in Keanu's hands, then back at his friend. "But what if the fall is too hard? What if we lose everything?" Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "Victor, you're not alone in this. You've already made it through the worst part. You've built something meaningful here. And what makes you think I'd let you fall? We'll figure it out. Just take it one step at a time. You don't need to solve everything in one day. This is a journey, not a sprint." Victor's shoulders relaxed as Keanu's words sunk in. Maybe he was right. Maybe he had been trying to carry the weight of everything on his own for far too long. The cafe wasn't just his to save. It was the community's too. The people who had rallied behind him were just as invested in its future as he was. That night, after the cafe had closed, Victor and Keanu sat in the quiet of the empty cafe, sipping coffee and planning for the next step. They discussed ways to expand, how to continue building a loyal customer base, and ways to make the cafe even more integral to the community. There was no time to waste, but just as they were deep in conversation, an unexpected knock on the door broke their focus. Victor glanced at Keanu, confused. It was late and the cafe was closed. Keanu stood and walked toward the door. When he opened it, a familiar face stood on the other side. It was Lila, the woman who had once worked as a barista at the cafe. She had left months ago, and her departure had added to the stress and uncertainty Victor had faced. But now, here she was, standing in front of him, a determined look on her face. "Lila?" Victor asked, his voice uncertain. She nodded, stepping inside. "I heard about what happened, about the campaign and everything. I know I left on bad terms, but I want to make things right. I want to come back." Victor exchanged a quick glance with Keanu, who had returned to the table, curious. "I'm glad to hear that, Lila. But things are a little different now. We're in a better place, but we're not out of the woods yet." Lila nodded, her expression serious. "I get it, but I think I can help. I've been working at another cafe, and I've learned a lot. I know how to attract more customers, improve the flow of business. I want to use what I've learned to help this place grow. I don't want to just come back. I want to contribute." Victor sat back in his chair, a mixture of surprise and skepticism on his face. Lila had always been a talented barista, but she had also been a bit of a wild card, someone who didn't always see eye to eye with him. The idea of letting her back into the fold was risky, but something in her eyes told him she was serious. Keanu leaned forward, studying Lila with a thoughtful look. "I think we could use someone like you. But it's not just about the cafe, it's about the team. Are you ready to be part of something bigger than yourself?" Lila nodded. "I am. I've seen what this place means to people. I want to help make it stronger. I'm ready to put in the work." Victor sighed, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. He had come so far, and everything felt like it was hanging in the balance. The cafe was a fragile thing, and every decision could tip the scale one way or another. But then, looking around at Keanu, at Lila, and at the empty cafe that had once felt like an impossible dream, Victor made his decision. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "You're in. But we're all in this together. No more games, no more uncertainty. This place needs to feel like a family again. We're all going to work as one." Lila smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. Keanu nodded, his trademark grin spreading across his face. Victor had made the right call, and now with a renewed team they were ready to face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but together they were stronger than ever. The morning after their decision to bring Lila back, a fresh wave of energy seemed to sweep through the cafe. Victor had a renewed sense of optimism, and the team felt like they were on the brink of something big. "Lila, who had always been a strong personality, brought with her new ideas and a sense of urgency that had been missing for a while. She immediately got to work, diving into the cafe's menu and operations with the kind of enthusiasm Victor hadn't seen in months. She was hands-on, offering new menu suggestions, improving the flow of the kitchen, and even experimenting with different coffee blends to enhance the cafe's signature offerings. Every idea felt fresh, like the cafe was getting a much-needed makeover, both in its products and in its atmosphere. Victor watched as Lila took charge with a sense of purpose, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. But there was one thing still lingering in the back of his mind: can this last? Despite their progress, the cafe still had a long way to go. The crowdfunding money had bought them some breathing room, but Victor knew they couldn't rely on it forever. The challenge now wasn't just about keeping the doors open, it was about making sure the cafe could continue to stand strong in the future, without the constant pressure of financial instability. One Thursday afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with activity, Victor and Keanu sat down together to discuss the next phase of their plan. "Keanu, we've made a lot of changes, but we still need more. More customers, more visibility, more business," Victor said, looking out over the room. "How do we take this to the next level?" Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. "I think we need to think outside the box. People don't just want good coffee. They want an experience. They want something that makes them feel like they're part of something." Victor nodded slowly. "So what's the next step?" Keanu's eyes lit up with excitement. "What if we partnered with other local businesses? We could hold collaborative events, maybe even team up with artists, musicians, or other small cafes. Get our name out there and create a sense of community that's bigger than just us." Victor's mind started racing. It was a brilliant idea, but there was one problem. They were still struggling to stay afloat. Could they really afford to work with other businesses, even if the potential payoff was huge? Just then, Lila walked by with a tray of freshly made pastries, her arms full of delicious offerings. She smiled brightly as she overheard their conversation. "Overheard you guys talking about collaborations," Lila said. "I've been thinking about that too. I've got a few ideas for local musicians who could perform here. We could do acoustic nights, poetry readings, or even create a special coffee and art event. People would love that." Victor raised an eyebrow, impressed by Lila's enthusiasm. "You're onto something, Lila, but we need to be careful. We don't have unlimited funds to spend on big marketing campaigns. We've got to make sure whatever we do is sustainable." Lila's smile never wavered. "That's the beauty of it. We don't need a huge budget. We just need to use our strengths, our community. We can build partnerships with local businesses who are willing to work with us. We'll do it organically, but with purpose." Victor's mind spun with possibilities. They could use the cafe's existing loyal customers as a launchpad to attract more. The local community had been their backbone when they needed it most. Now it was time to give back and show them they mattered. Over the next few weeks, the cafe underwent a remarkable transformation. Lila worked tirelessly to set up collaborations with local artists, musicians, and even some of the nearby shops. On weekends, the cafe hosted small events, a live jazz band on Fridays, a local author reading from their book on Saturdays, and Sundays dedicated to community brunches with local vendors offering fresh produce and homemade goods. Slowly but surely the cafe's reputation spread, and the word of mouth began to pay off. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon and the cafe's warm lights began to shine, the place was packed. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, and people lined up at the counter, waiting for their turn to grab a cup of their favorite brew. Victor couldn't help but smile as he looked around at the people he'd once thought he might lose. They were back, and they were thriving. Keanu stood next to him watching the scene unfold. "This is it, Victor. We've got something special here. Look at this place." Victor smiled, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. "It's not just the cafe, Keanu. It's everything that has led to this moment. The people, the community, the hard work. It's all paying off." But just as things seemed to be falling into place, the cafe faced another test, one that would push the team to its breaking point. It all started when one of the local businesses they had been collaborating with suddenly pulled out. A nearby bakery, which had been supplying the cafe with its popular pastries, informed Victor that they could no longer provide their goods due to a sudden increase in their own production costs. It was a blow that hit hard. Victor was devastated. Without the bakery's pastries, he knew the cafe would lose one of its main draws. They couldn't afford to lose any part of what had made them successful. Without hesitation, he called Lila. "Fi, don't know what we're going to do," Victor said, his voice strained. "The bakery is out and we're left with a major hole in our menu. We can't just replace their pastries with something cheaper." Lila was quiet for a moment, then said, "Victor, we don't have to replace them. We have to create our own. We have the kitchen space, we have the staff, and we have the customers who trust us. This is our opportunity to create something unique." Victor felt a spark of inspiration. Maybe it was time to step up and create something truly special, something that would set them apart from every other cafe. If they couldn't rely on outside vendors, then they would do it themselves. Over the next few days, Lila worked closely with the kitchen team, experimenting with recipes and ingredients. They baked pastries from scratch, crafted new items for the menu, and offered samples to their customers. Slowly, the new creations began to catch on. People started ordering pastries they couldn't get anywhere else, exclusive to their cafe. The cafe was not only surviving, it was beginning to thrive in ways Victor had never imagined. The uncertainty that once plagued him seemed a distant memory, and in its place he felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. Looking out over the bustling cafe that evening, Victor knew that the real victory wasn't just about keeping the doors open. It was about transforming the cafe into something that had real meaning, a place of connection, a hub of creativity, and a testament to the power of resilience. He turned to Keanu and Lila, who were both standing beside him, taking in the scene. "We've come a long way," Victor said quietly. Keanu smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "And we've still got a long way to go, but together there's nothing we can't handle." Lila raised her coffee cup in a small toast. "To the next chapter." Victor smiled, raising his own cup. To the next chapter. The cafe wasn't just a place to get coffee anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when people refused to give up, when they believed in each other, and when they were willing to do whatever it took to turn a dream into a reality. The cafe had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of perseverance, community, and creativity. What had started as a small, struggling cafe in danger of closing had blossomed into a thriving hub of local culture. Victor, Keanu, Lila, and their team were finally enjoying the fruits of their hard work. But deep down, they all knew the road to success wasn't paved with guarantees. They were walking on the edge, and with every passing day, they wondered what new twist would test their resilience. It came sooner than they expected. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with its usual crowd, a sharply dressed man walked through the door, his polished shoes clicking on the wooden floor. He had a confident air about him, his eyes scanning the space like a hawk surveying its surroundings. The customers didn't notice him at first, but Victor did. He immediately recognized the man's presence. This was no casual visitor. The man made his way to the counter, where Victor was finishing up an order. "Excuse me, are you Victor?" the man asked, his voice smooth and calculated. Victor wiped his hands on his apron and nodded. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Charles Montgomery. I represent a group of investors interested in buying this cafe." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We believe it has potential. We can take it to the next level. But we need to make a few changes." Victor's heart sank. He had heard of these types of investors before, well-dressed, smooth talkers with promises of greater success. But their vision often came at a cost. They were looking for businesses to buy, but only to reshape them into something they could control. "Wait a minute," Victor said, his voice steady but a hint of wariness creeping in. "This place isn't for sale. We've worked too hard to build it. We're not interested in selling to anyone." Charles's smile didn't falter. "I understand your hesitation, but think about it. This cafe has become something special, hasn't it? It's more than just a place to get coffee. You've built a community around it, and we know how to help it grow even more. You've done well, but there's a bigger opportunity waiting for you if you let us come on board. Victor felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. They had worked so hard to get here. Could he really trust someone like this? Was he willing to sell out everything they had fought for in exchange for a bigger, more profitable future? The thought of losing the soul of the cafe, the personal touch, the community connections, made his stomach churn. "I'm not interested," Victor said firmly, his resolve hardening. "We've found our own way to succeed. We're not for sale." Charles seemed unfazed by Victor's rejection. "Well, I understand, but just know that the offer is on the table. Think it over." He turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me." Victor watched him leave, his mind racing. Keanu, who had been quietly observing the conversation from a nearby table, stood up and approached. "Who was that guy?" Keanu asked, his voice laced with concern. "That was Charles Montgomery. He wants to buy the cafe. Apparently he represents some investors who think we can take this place to the next level." Victor shook his head. "But I don't know if I'm ready to hand over control like that. We've worked too hard to let someone come in and change everything." Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "Victor, I get it. But remember, you don't have to do anything. It's your decision. But I think we've learned something by now. We're not in this alone. Whatever happens, we face it together." Victor nodded, feeling a sense of comfort in Keanu's words. No matter what happened next, they would face it as a team. The following days were filled with uncertainty. Victor couldn't stop thinking about the offer Charles had made. He kept running over the conversation in his mind, wondering if he'd made the right decision by rejecting it. What if he was turning down an opportunity for the cafe to grow even more? What if he was holding on to something that wasn't sustainable in the long run? But every time he looked around the cafe, he realized something. This place wasn't just a business to him. It was a piece of his soul. It was a place where memories were made, where people gathered, and where the community had found a sense of belonging. Could he really put a price on that? Victor didn't have the answers. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't make this decision alone. He needed to talk to the people who had been with him from the start. Keanu, Leela, the team. That evening, as the cafe quieted down and the last of the customers left, Victor gathered the team in the back office. He told them everything: the offer from Charles Montgomery, the investors, and the pressure he was feeling. Keanu spoke up first. "Victor, I get why you're conflicted, but if we're going to make it through, we need to do it on our own terms. We've built something real here, something that people love. We don't need investors to tell us how to run this place." Leela nodded. "Keanu's right. We've created something unique. If we give that up now, what's the point of everything we've fought for? We've come too far to let someone else take over." The team rallied behind Victor, their voices filled with support. In that moment, Victor realized something important. He wasn't alone in this. They were all in it together. They had built this cafe together, and no matter how difficult the future might be, they would face it side by side. The next day, Victor called Charles Montgomery. "I've thought about your offer," Victor said, his voice steady, "and I've made my decision. We're not selling." Charles's tone remained polite but firm. "I see. Well, I can't say I'm not disappointed, but if you ever change your mind, don't hesitate to reach out." Victor hung up the phone, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice. The cafe was theirs, and they would continue to build it on their own terms. As the days turned into weeks, Victor and his team poured everything they had into the cafe. The challenges were still there: financial pressures, competition, and the uncertainty of the future. But they faced them together. And with each passing day, they grew stronger. The community that had supported them from the beginning continued to show up, buying coffee, attending events, and spreading the word about the cafe. It was more than just a place to get a caffeine fix. It was a home, a sanctuary for those who needed it. And in the end, that was worth more than any offer, more than any investor's dream of expansion. Because when you have a community behind you, when you have people who believe in you and the work you're doing, that's when you truly have everything. The café had weathered many storms, and in its wake it stood tall, its roots deep in the community it had grown to love. But even with the challenges behind them, Victor knew that the real test was just beginning. The café had become a part of the fabric of their town, a place where stories were shared over coffee and memories were made in every corner. And now, with the team stronger than ever, it was time to look forward, not just for the café but for themselves. Months passed since they rejected Charles Montgomery's offer, and things had continued to improve. The café had gained a reputation for being the go-to spot for great coffee, unique pastries, and a welcoming environment. Every night, when the lights dimmed and the team gathered to clean up, it was clear that they had found their rhythm. But there was still a lingering question. How could they keep growing without losing what had made them special in the first place? One rainy evening, as Victor stood by the counter watching the rain pour down outside, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The place was packed, and laughter filled the air as people chatted over their coffee. Keanu had taken on more of the managerial responsibilities. Lila had become the face of their brand, and the staff had become more like a family. They had managed to build a sustainable future for themselves, but Victor couldn't shake the thought that there was still more to do. The world outside was constantly changing, and if they wanted to continue to grow and evolve, they needed to think bigger. But they couldn't do it the way big corporations did. No, they had to maintain the authenticity that had been their foundation. "Keanu," Victor said, catching his friend as he passed by the counter, "we need to talk about the next step. We've done well so far, but we can't stop here." Keanu smiled, always ready for a challenge. "You're right, so what's the next step?" Victor looked around at the café, taking in the laughter, the conversations, and the warm ambiance. "We've built something real, but I think it's time to think about expanding, not just here but beyond. We have a brand now. People love what we've created, and there's no reason why we can't share it with more people." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking bigger, huh? Are we talking about another location?" Victor nodded. "It's a big leap, but I think we can do it. We don't have to compromise on what makes us special. We just need to find the right balance." As they discussed their vision, Lila approached, overhearing their conversation. She smiled, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I've been thinking the same thing. What if we could partner with other local businesses in new cities? We wouldn't just open another café. We'd create a network of small local businesses, all connected by our brand. Imagine the possibilities." Victor looked at both Keanu and Lila, feeling a surge of excitement. They were on the same page, and that meant they could make it happen, in tax. The weeks that followed, the team worked tirelessly, outlining plans for expansion, while keeping the heart of the café intact. They wanted to stay true to their roots, focusing on community, creativity, and sustainability. They would only open new locations in places that shared the same values, building relationships with local artists, musicians, and vendors to create the kind of atmosphere they had fostered at their original café. The café's name, once a local secret, was now beginning to circulate in nearby cities. People who had visited the café on road trips or business trips were sharing their experiences with friends and family. Social media had played a huge role in this growing word-of-mouth campaign, and Victor found himself fielding inquiries from people who had heard about the café and wanted to know if there were any other locations in the area. The buzz was growing, and it was clear that they had the potential to turn their café into something much bigger. But this wasn't just about growth for growth's sake. Victor wasn't interested in creating a chain that would lose its soul. It was about staying true to what made the café special: its people, its community, and its commitment to quality. One chilly autumn morning, as the team gathered in the EC back office to review their plans, Lila stood up and raised her coffee cup. "To the future, and to staying true to what we've built here." Everyone joined in, raising their cups. It was more than just a toast. It was a promise that no matter how big they grew, they would never lose sight of the heart and soul of the café. Months later, the first new location opened in a nearby town, and it was a resounding success. The community embraced the café as their own, and the team worked hard to ensure that it felt just as personal and authentic as the original. They partnered with local musicians for live performances, worked with local farmers for fresh ingredients, and supported local artists by showcasing their work on the cafe's walls. It was a continuation of the dream they had started together, a dream that was no longer limited to just one place. As the new cafe buzzed with activity, Victor stood behind the counter, looking out at the customers who had already made themselves at home. He thought back to that dark day when he had felt like giving up, when he had nearly lost everything. But now, standing in this new space, with his team beside him and the cafe thriving, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude and awe. They had built something real, something worth fighting for. Keanu walked up to him, his eyes full of pride. "We did it, Victor. We're not just a cafe anymore, we're a movement." Victor smiled, looking around at the bustling cafe. "We did it together, and we'll keep doing it, one step at a time." Lila joined them, her voice filled with excitement. "And this is just the beginning. We've got so much more to share with the world." Victor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had accomplished and everything that was yet to come. He knew that no matter where this journey took them, they had created something that mattered, a place where people didn't just come for coffee, but came for a sense of connection, for a sense of belonging. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?